For a long time, the questions we asked about human suffering were questions about the soul, or character, or even morality. If someone struggled with deep sadness or erratic behavior, the explanation often lived in the realm of the spiritual or the personal. But over the last 60 years, that lens has shifted. We have moved toward a medical model, a way of seeing mental health through the lens of biology, chemistry, and the brain. A major part of this shift is visible in the evolution of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. As this manual has changed over the decades, there has been a clear effort to align psychiatry with medicine, incorporating data from neuroscience and neuroimaging to find biological markers for our struggles. Some authors argue that the large-scale adoption of the DSM was, in part, a response to the immense difficulty of creating a standardized way to classify these struggles, an effort to find a common language similar to other branches of medicine. But this move toward the biological has created a profound tension. When we focus on the broken mechanism inside an individual, we run the risk of decontextualizing their distress. We begin to treat the symptom as a purely internal malfunction, sometimes losing sight of the world that produced it. We see this tension play out in how we define what is normal versus abnormal. As researchers have noted, these definitions don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by the social and political environments we live in. This medicalisation of emotion and behaviour didn't happen without resistance. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a movement began to emerge from the broader civil rights era. These were people who had experienced psychiatric interventions that they described as unhelpful or even abusive. It was a movement of people seeking self-determination and rights, often described as talking back to the power of psychiatry. A key text in this development was Judy Chamberlain's 1978 book, On Our Own, which argued for patient-controlled alternatives to the traditional system. This history leaves us with a difficult balancing act. On one hand, the biological model gives us precise tools and medical treatments that can be life-saving. On the other hand, if we view trauma or depression solely as an individual pathology, a glitch in a person's biology, we might miss the larger, structural forces at play. We see this clearly in modern conflicts, like the current crisis in the Gaza Strip. When researchers look at the high rates of PTSD and depression among children there, they are increasingly arguing that we cannot view this simply as a collection of individual traumas. Instead, they suggest we must look at continuous traumatic stress, a term used to describe the psychological impact of prolonged bombardment, displacement, and the collapse of entire social systems. This leads some to ask whether we are treating a medical condition or witnessing a response to a broken environment. While the world around us can break a person, there is another way to look at suffering, one that looks inward, at the physical machinery of the brain itself. This is the neurobiological model, and it asks a question that has become part of our modern vocabulary. Is mental illness simply a matter of brain chemistry? For decades, a common way to understand this was through the chemical imbalance theory, the idea that depression is caused by a shortage of certain chemicals like serotonin. It offered a way to see depression as a medical condition, much like diabetes or asthma, something that could be measured and corrected. But as our understanding has deepened, that simple picture has begun to fray. Recent re-evaluations of the serotonin hypothesis suggest that the imbalance idea might be much more complicated than we were led to believe. Researchers are finding that methodological biases and the way certain studies were reported may have obscured the true role that serotonin plays. It isn't just a matter of having enough or not enough of a single substance, it is a much more intricate, shifting dance of signals. When we look at how traditional antidepressants, like SSRIs, actually work, we see this complexity in action. They don't just top up a chemical level. Instead, they seem to work over weeks by helping the brain reshape itself, promoting neuroplasticity and helping neurons form new connections. There is even newer research into rapid-acting treatments that target different pathways, like the mTOR1 pathway, which aim to restore how neurons communicate with one another almost immediately. This shift in thinking moves us away from the idea of a simple imbalance and toward a view of the brain as a complex, interconnected system. And because the brain is a physical organ, scientists are searching for the smoking guns of mental illness, what we call biomarkers. These are physical indicators that could allow us to move from general diagnoses to precision psychiatry. In the lab, researchers are looking at everything from the way brain waves oscillate, specifically in the gamma band frequency between 30 and 100 Hz, to the way our cells age. There is evidence suggesting that major depression may be linked to accelerated cellular aging, a molecular signature written into our very biology. The stakes of finding these markers are incredibly high, particularly when we look at suicide. It is a phenomenon that currently eludes a comprehensive, singular understanding, yet it accounts for over 720,000 deaths every year across the globe. We know there are neurobiological underpinnings to suicidal behavior, things like genetic vulnerabilities, epigenetic changes, and shifts in how the brain's physical structure functions. The hope is that by identifying these biological signatures, we could move from reacting to a crisis to predicting and preventing it before it happens. But there is a significant gap between what we see in a controlled laboratory setting and what happens in a doctor's office. Moving these biological discoveries into actual clinical practice is a massive challenge. And this brings us back to the tension at the heart of modern psychiatry. If we focus entirely on the synapse, the gene, or the biomarker, do we lose something essential? Critics argue that a purely neurobiological model can lead to a kind of reification, taking a theoretical idea of a disease and treating it as a fixed physical fact, while ignoring the very real, very human pressures of poverty, unemployment, and trauma. Looking at the synapse might reveal a chemical imbalance, but looking at the person reveals a life. This brings us to a fundamental question. How much of our psychological distress is actually a response to our environment? When researchers look at the link between poverty and mental health, they generally follow two different paths of logic. The first is called downward drift. This theory suggests that mental illness itself can act as a driver of instability. It proposes that people who are predisposed to certain mental health conditions may find it harder to maintain steady employment or complete education, causing them to drift into lower socioeconomic circumstances as a consequence of their illness. But there is another model, one that shifts the focus from the individual to the structure of society. This is social causation. This theory argues that it isn't just that mental illness leads to poverty, it's that poverty, inequality, and chronic instability create the very stress that triggers mental illness in the first place. It suggests that the environment itself acts as a weight, making it harder for the mind to maintain its footing. For decades, researchers have been trying to untangle these two directions. Much of the foundational literature on this, dating back to the mid-1990s, has leaned heavily toward the social causation model. To see just how much weight that carries, we can look at a large-scale meta-analysis of 60 different studies. This research looked at the odds of depression across different levels of socioeconomic status. What it found was that individuals in lower socioeconomic groups face significantly higher odds of being depressed. Specifically, the data showed they were nearly twice as likely to experience persistent depression compared to those in the highest socioeconomic groups. Though the authors note that this association is heterogeneous and can vary based on measurement and context. The meta-analysis also identified what researchers call a dose-response relationship, meaning that, statistically, as levels of income or education decreased, the likelihood of depression tended to rise. When we see these patterns, it becomes difficult to view depression as a purely internal, biological event. If the distress is tied so closely to the stability of one's housing, the security of one's paycheck, or the level of education available, then the broken synapse looks less like a random glitch and more like a predictable response to a difficult reality. This perspective reframes mental health as a matter of social justice. Advocates argue that if we only treat the symptoms in a clinic, but ignore the structural factors, the intergenerational cycles of disadvantage and the lack of social safety nets, we are only doing half the work. They argue that addressing the social determinants of mental health is not just a medical necessity, but a requirement for a fair society. However, the science is not a closed book. There is no clear consensus on the exact causative factors. It is incredibly difficult to isolate whether it is the stress of poverty that causes the illness, or whether the illness makes navigating poverty more difficult. The association is complex and, as some researchers point out, often controversial because it is so difficult to measure. But even with that uncertainty, the scale of the evidence forces us to confront a difficult possibility that for many people, what we call mental illness might be a very rational, very human response to an irrational and unstable world. This leads some to ask, if we are witnessing the toll of a broken environment, how do those environmental cracks eventually become a clinical fracture? To see this, we can look at a case study from Portugal involving an adolescent experiencing their first episode of psychosis. In a clinical setting, a first episode of psychosis is often treated as a biological event, a sudden, internal storm in the brain that needs to be managed with medication and stabilization. But for this young person, the medical diagnosis was only one part of a much larger, more complicated picture. The doctors and researchers observing this case found that the clinical symptoms didn't emerge in a vacuum. Instead, they were inseparable from a web of social risks. There was poverty, which creates a baseline of constant, grinding stress. There was family dysfunction, meaning the very place that should have been a source of stability was instead a source of volatility. When these factors converge, the question changes. We are no longer just asking, how do we treat this episode of psychosis? We have to ask, how can a person recover when their environment is actively working against them? In this specific instance, the authors of the case study found that these social determinants didn't just happen alongside the psychosis, they acted as triggers for it and influenced the prognosis, the likely course of the illness. When a person's home life is unstable and their economic resources are depleted, the clinical problem becomes much harder to solve. It's one thing to stabilize a patient in a hospital. It is quite another to support them as they try to navigate a world that offers very little in the way of community-based care or rehabilitation services. This case highlights a systemic gap. Even in developed countries, there is often a failure to provide what is considered best practice care that extends beyond the hospital walls and into the actual, messy reality of a patient's life. Without community-based support to help bridge the gap between a hospital bed and a stable home, the prognosis for someone facing these kinds of social risks becomes much more uncertain. This brings us to a critical junction. When does social risk become a clinical crisis? If a person's poverty and family instability are directly influencing whether their psychosis becomes a manageable condition or a lifelong disability, then the distinction between social issue and medical issue starts to dissolve. The tool we use to decide which is which matters immensely. For decades, that tool has been the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In recent years, the DSM has moved toward a more neurobiological model. The idea is that by focusing on brain chemistry and genetic markers, we can move away from old-fashioned biases and toward a more objective scientific way of understanding suffering. But critics argue that this focus on the synapse comes with a hidden cost. It tends to decontextualise distress. When we look at a symptom, like a person's profound sadness or their inability to find motivation, and we view it primarily as a biological glitch, we risk looking right past the reasons why that person is suffering in the first place. This becomes particularly complicated when we cross borders. While the latest revisions of the DSM claim to incorporate greater cultural sensitivity, some researchers argue that this is inconsistent at best. They suggest the manual often applies culture in ways that reflect an ethnocentric bias. In practice, one author posits that this can create what they call an ethnic dividing line in psychiatry. This is the idea that for some patients, the clinician looks at their social and cultural context, but for others, often those in Western middle-class settings, the context is ignored in favor of a purely biological explanation. The author argues this creates a two-tier system where culture is treated as an outlier or an exception rather than the very fabric of human experience. We see this tension play out clearly in research from sub-Saharan Africa. There is often a profound gap between the psychological frameworks used in the DSM and the local spiritual interpretations of trauma. If a person's distress is understood through a spiritual lens by their community, but a clinician insists on a strictly psychological or neurological diagnosis, we aren't just disagreeing on a label, we are potentially misreading the person's entire reality. Even when we try to account for massive shared events, like the historical trauma experienced by refugees, the clinical models can struggle. Take, for example, the experience of survivors of large-scale tragedies, such as the Cambodian genocide. There is a temptation to assume that because a group shares a history of immense loss, they will all share a similar clinical experience of trauma. But researchers warn this can create an illusion of a common destiny. It's a way of flattening out individual fates. In reality, the way an individual psyche navigates the constraints of their culture and their trauma is deeply personal. People find hidden paths through their suffering that a standardized checklist might never capture. If we rely too heavily on a biological blueprint, we might find ourselves very good at identifying a malfunctioning mechanism, but very bad at understanding the person. We risk treating the symptoms of a difficult life as if they were simply the symptoms of a broken brain. But if we only look for symptoms that fit into a Western medical manual, we might miss the language people use to describe their own lives. In medical anthropology, there is a concept called idioms of distress. It's the idea that the way we experience and express pain isn't just a biological reflex, it's shaped by the culture we live in. For some, distress might show up as a change in how they eat, or as physical aches in the body, or even as a belief that they are being affected by spirits or sorcery. These aren't just superstitions to be cleared away by a doctor. They are culturally meaningful ways of communicating that something is wrong. We see this tension play out clearly in the experiences of refugees. In Kenya, researchers working with Somali refugees found that the standard Western mental health approach often fails to capture the reality of their suffering. When clinicians use only clinical, westernized diagnostic tools, they often overlook the specific ways these individuals explain their distress. Through interviews and focus groups, researchers identified several distinct Somali terms that describe different states of being, words like bufis, well, or jinn. Some of these terms describe a sense of anxiety or sadness, while others have deep spiritual dimensions, like jinn, referring to spirit possession. For a refugee, using these words isn't just about naming a symptom, it's about using a shared cultural language to make sense of a shattered world. When clinical models ignore these terms, they risk creating a gap where the most important part of the patient's experience, their own understanding of their pain, is left behind. This leads us to a broader, more systemic concept, social suffering. This is the idea that what looks like a mental health crisis might actually be a direct response to the way a person is being treated by the world around them. Take the Rohingya refugees. The United Nations has described them as the most persecuted minority group in world history. For them, the challenges aren't just occurring within their minds, they're being driven by a relentless interplay of political, environmental, and social factors. When you look at the high rates of depression, anxiety, and insomnia in these communities, it is difficult to view them solely through a medical lens. It is hard to separate a person's psychological state from the reality of living in extreme poverty, facing constant unemployment, enduring overcrowding, or dealing with the loss of a social identity. If we treat a Rohingya refugee's insomnia or anxiety only as a chemical imbalance to be corrected with medication, we might be ignoring the social suffering that caused it. We might be treating the symptom of a life defined by displacement and human rights deprivation, rather than acknowledging the systemic forces that made that life so difficult to bear. The challenge is to find a way to bridge that gap, to create a way of listening that respects both the chemistry of the brain and the lived reality of the person. But what happens when that bridge fails? What happens when a patient's reality simply doesn't match the doctor's diagnosis? It sounds like a simple question of communication, but for many, it is a much deeper, more structural problem. In philosophy, there is a term for this, epistemic injustice. It describes a specific kind of harm that happens when a person is dismissed as a credible source of information about their own life. It's not just a disagreement over a treatment plan, it's the feeling that the very tools we use to understand the mind are being used to silence the person living inside it. We see this tension play out most sharply in the way clinical records are written. Take, for example, the experience of people living with dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Because this diagnosis is often met with skepticism within the medical community, patients frequently face a form of epistemic injustice, where their history of complex trauma is documented in ways that make their lived reality seem incoherent or even unbelievable. When a clinician fails to accurately capture the nuances of a patient's trauma, the record itself becomes a barrier. There is a growing concern among researchers that if these flawed, incomplete clinical records are used to train the next generation of medical AI, we won't just be repeating old mistakes, we will be scaling them, automating the dismissal of complex human experiences on a massive scale. This gap between what a person knows to be true about themselves and what the medical system is willing to recognize creates what some scholars call shadow epistemologies. This concept is used to describe a tension often found within the neurodiversity movement, a movement that emerged largely as a political response to the way neurodivergent people, particularly autistic individuals, have been treated by mainstream psychology. When a person's internal experience of their own mind doesn't align with the formal institutional recognition of a diagnosis, they often have to develop their own parallel ways of validating what they know to be true. These shadow epistemologies are complex. On one hand, they act as a vital, legitimate challenge to psychiatric power, allowing people to reclaim their identity from a system that might otherwise try to fix them. On the other hand, these parallel systems can sometimes act as a form of resistance to clinical information that might actually be helpful. It creates a fundamental conflict, a clash between first-person knowledge, the raw, lived certainty of being in a body, and third-person clinical observation, the data-driven view of a doctor looking at a patient. This tension is at the heart of the debate over how we treat neurodivergence. Much of mainstream psychology has historically focused on modifying behavior, essentially trying to train people to act more typically. But for many in the neurodiversity movement, this feels less like medical care and more like an attempt to erase the person's natural way of being. They argue that critical psychology and the neurodiversity movement need each other to fight this trend, resisting the urge to pathologize difference and instead working to address the actual social barriers and ableism that make being different so difficult. When we move from the biological blueprint to these social and philosophical questions, the stakes change. We aren't just talking about whether a medication works or whether a brain scan shows a specific pattern. We are talking about the right to be believed. We are talking about whether the medical system is a bridge that helps us understand ourselves, or a wall that keeps us from being seen at all. If we move from the social structures of the physical world to the digital ones, the question of how our environment shapes us doesn't just stay relevant, it becomes immediate. For an adolescent, the environment is no longer just a schoolyard or a neighborhood, it is a stream of content, curated by invisible logic, delivered through a screen. In a study of 87 teenagers in Ireland, researchers found that while young people actually have a pretty sophisticated understanding of how these algorithms work, they often feel powerless against them. They describe these as boundary violations, instances where an algorithm interprets a moment of brief attention, like a single click or a pause while scrolling, as a deep, lasting interest. This can lead to a progression of content, where a user might start with something harmless, like fashion videos, but find themselves being pushed toward increasingly graphic or disturbing material, like violence or explicit content, without ever having searched for it. For the girls in that study, this feeling of vulnerability was particularly acute. They reported receiving unsolicited and predatory messages from older men after posting content online, leaving them feeling vulnerable and exposed. This isn't just about individual bad actors, though, it's about the architecture of the platforms themselves. A narrative review of existing research suggests that the impact of social media isn't the same for everyone. It depends heavily on how we use it. For instance, passive or compulsive engagement, the kind where you find yourself scrolling without a clear purpose, is associated with higher risks of anxiety, depression, and body dissatisfaction. Neuroimaging studies have even suggested that this kind of use can activate the reward-related regions of the brain, potentially reinforcing those problematic patterns. This brings us to a question of who is most at risk. A long-term study in the UK, which followed over 2,000 adolescents for over a decade, found that social media use is more strongly associated with poorer mental health outcomes, specifically things like low self-esteem and body dissatisfaction in girls than in boys. The researchers suggested something called a social push model. The idea is that for some, social media acts as a pervasive, adverse environment that can actually compress genetic differences. In other words, the authors propose that for adolescent girls, the digital environment may be acting as a pervasive pressure that elevates mental health risks across the board. When we look at it this way, the adolescent mind isn't just a biological entity maturing in a vacuum. It is a mind being shaped by an environment that is constantly learning from it, reacting to it, and, sometimes, misinterpreting it. We are left wondering if the digital world is simply a new room for the same old social pressures, or if the algorithms themselves are fundamentally altering the way a generation experiences the world. If the environment shapes the mind, the clinical setting is where that shaping meets the heavy hand of intervention. This is where we have to ask, is the goal of treatment to help a person reintegrate into their life, or is it to manage the ways they disrupt the systems around them? For those living with a diagnosis like borderline personality disorder, the answer often feels tied to the medication they are prescribed. In a qualitative study of 6 individuals, the experience of taking psychiatric drugs wasn't described as a simple chemical correction. Instead, many participants described their medication in deeply contradictory ways, as something both necessary and destabilizing, both protective and punitive. For these individuals, a pill isn't just a biochemical intervention. It can act as a symbolic gesture within the relationship between patient and clinician. It can be a way for a doctor to communicate care, or a way to manage perceived risk and reassert authority when a patient's emotions become volatile. Some researchers have even argued that the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder itself functions less like a clinical description and more like a regulatory tool, a way to use gendered or social norms to moralize distress and manage how certain people behave in the face of trauma. But the question of control moves beyond the pharmacy and into the very architecture of our hospitals. In England, a study of 73 participants explored the reality of long-term segregation, the practice of isolating patients in secure rooms for extended periods. For many of those interviewed, the experience was not therapeutic. They described it as dehumanizing and profoundly harmful. The findings suggest that when we use isolation to manage behavior, we may be moving beyond clinical care and into the realm of human rights violations, potentially breaching international protections for the rights of children and people with disabilities. There is a recognition, at least in policy, that this practice is problematic. A program called HOPES, running through 2025, was launched specifically to reduce or end the use of long-term segregation for autistic people, children, and individuals with learning disabilities. Yet, the tension remains. We see a system caught between 2 definitions of success. On one hand, there is the medical model, aiming to stabilize the brain and the behavior through medication and containment. On the other, there is the human rights model, which argues that true recovery cannot happen in isolation or under the weight of a diagnosis that might be more about regulating a person's identity than treating their suffering. As we move from the chemistry of the individual to the structure of the institution, the question remains, are we building a system that holds a person steady enough to heal, or one that simply holds them still? So, where do we go from here? If the old ways of seeing mental health, as either a broken machine to be fixed or a soul in turmoil, both feel incomplete, perhaps the answer isn't in choosing one over the other, but in how we weave them together. One way to rethink this is to stop looking for a single thing to cure. For a long time, researchers operated on the assumption that depression is a discrete, solid condition, a single box you either fit into or you don't. But some researchers argue that this approach might actually be slowing us down. They suggest we should view depression instead as a network of symptoms. In this view, it isn't one underlying disease causing a list of problems. Instead, the symptoms themselves are interconnected. Insomnia leads to fatigue, which leads to a loss of concentration, which leads to social withdrawal. It's a web of cause and effect. If we treat the symptoms as a shifting, interconnected system rather than a static label, we might find more effective ways to intervene. But even if we understand the biology of that web, we still have to deal with the person living inside it. This is where the looping effect comes in. It's the idea that psychiatric labels don't just describe a person, they can actually change them. When a person is told they have a specific diagnosis, they may begin to see themselves through that lens, which in turn changes how they act and how they experience their own life. This creates a feedback loop. Researchers have proposed that this loop can be disrupted by what they call looping breaks. This is a theoretical concept where the feedback loop between a person and the medical system is broken by epistemic injustices, disruptions caused by things like identity prejudice or the dismissal of a patient's credibility. When these breaks occur, the stability and validity of a diagnosis can be undermined, potentially losing the connection to the actual human being. We see the practical fallout of this gap in how people actually try to get help. In a study of high school students in a rural Canadian town, researchers found that the barriers to care weren't the same for everyone. For those who had already accessed services, the struggle was practical, a lack of qualified professionals or poor communication between providers. But for those who had never stepped into a clinic, the barriers were much more personal, a fear of social stigma and a fundamental uncertainty about what treatment would even look like. If we want to move forward, the evidence suggests we need a model that is as complex as the people it serves. It requires a system that recognizes how symptoms can influence one another in a complex network, respects the way labels can shape a person's identity, and addresses the very real social fears that keep people from walking through the door. It means building a system that doesn't just aim to hold a person steady, but one that actually listens when they try to tell us who they are.